Everything History is now taking on the French Revolution. With episode 5 today, we'll be taking a closer look at what exactly caused the revolution in France.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
As an admonition, just kidding, no one needs to use that word. So as a forewarning to the show, I just want to point out that there's going to be a lot of Louis dropped in this podcast. Meaning that I will quite literally say Louis, whether it be the 13th or the 16th, a lot. And I just want to warn you, because there's no real way around it. So keep that in mind. Before we dive into our new story, let's look a little bit into the future. What I'll be doing with the French Revolution is going from beginning to end, but I won't be stopping the podcast there. I'll keep going after 1799 and continue following France's story after Napoleon takes power. This journey will take us through the pains of revolution, the reign of terror, Napoleon's ascendancy, the creation of France's first republic, France's reconfiguration into an empire, the Napoleonic Wars, and much more. It's going to be an exciting story that I am absolutely looking forward to. Also, I feel you deserve some sort of preface to the French Revolution. I don't mean background information, but rather an explanation of its importance. One later member of the British government described it by saying, "In Europe, the impulse towards liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty had to come from elsewhere. It came from France. The English Revolution had been an entirely domestic affair. So in the main had the American, but the French Revolution was to spread out from Paris across the whole continent. It gave rise to a generation of warfare, and its echoes reverberated long into the 19th century afterwards. Every great popular and national movement, until the Bolsheviks gave a fresh turn to events in 1917, was to invoke the principles set forth at Versailles in 1789. End quote. The revolution in France is one of the most important sequences of events in human history. It has had a profound effect throughout the globe, and most especially on modern Europe. As an American, I have no problem saying that the French Revolution was far more important in the scope of history than the American Revolution will ever be. Those are fighting words among some groups of historians, but I don't mean to pick a fight here. I'll let you, the listener, decide for yourself how you choose to see the French Revolution. With all that out of the way, let us get to business. The causes of the French Revolution. There have been an innumerable amount of papers, books, and discussions on that topic. What that tells me is that I have a lot of source material. Much of the debate about the causes has been settled already, and what people continue to debate now is semantics. What that means is that we know the causes, but historians and the like simply argue about which causes were more impactful or more important in instigating the revolution. Some will argue that the French Revolution was caused almost entirely by France's financial crisis. Others blame it on King Louis XVI. Others on the antiquated social structure of the late 18th century France. I will not presume to know which cause is truthfully more important, so my strategy in tackling the causes of the French Revolution will be to deconstruct every major cause one at a time to give you the full picture. Also, there's a lot of French phrases and words that I will be obliged to say, and I apologize ahead of time if I butcher any pronunciations. That being said, I will break the causes into 4 main groups: social, cultural, political, and economical. They will overlap in many ways, but let's begin with the social and societal causes. French society in the 1780s was much the same as it was in the 16th century, and that was part of the problem. Historians now refer to France before 1789 as the Ancien Régime. That phrase looks like ancient regime and roughly means old regime. The Kingdom of France in the old regime had been divided into a 3-class societal structure since the rule of Henry IV in the late 1500s, early 1600s. These 3 classes were called estates. The first estate was made up of the clergy, the second estate was that of the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else in France. By population percentages, the first estate made up about 0.5%, the second estate about 2%, leaving the other 97.5% of the population in the third estate. The main issue with this system was the absolute lack of mobility between the estates. Someone in the third estate had basically no shot to climb the social ladder in France. That is why it is a bit of a misnomer to call the 3 estates of France social classes, because in reality they were social castes. A caste, by the way, is essentially an immovable social group. If such a social order sounds medieval to you, that's because it was. The Three Estates are a great example of how outdated France's society had become. It was designed to work well within a feudalistic state, which France still technically was all the way up to 1789. Feudalism, by the way, was a form of government made popular in the Middle Ages of Europe. How feudalism worked was, the crown, be they king or queen, technically owned the entire kingdom, and the nobles of the country would hold certain lands in exchange, usually, for military service and taxes. And the peasant population would live on the nobles' land in exchange for labor, taxes, and other services. The system in France had broken down in many ways through the centuries, but it essentially remained the same at its core. That also meant that the monarch in France was an absolute monarch, meaning he or she had the authority to do whatever he or she wanted. The King of France as of 1774 onward was King Louis XVI, and his authority as an absolute monarch, as you'll see, will be tested in the late 1780s. So feudalism was still playing a role in France, and this plays directly into the social troubles that France will soon experience. This is so because of how taxes were paid and collected in France. Every year, nobles collected taxes through the commoners and peasants that lived on their lands. The nobles would then pass such tax money on to the King of France. So what's bad about that, besides the tax money being given indirectly to the crown? The problem lay in France's tax code. Remember the Three Estates of France? Well, this is why they are important, because each estate was treated differently, far differently when it came to taxes. The first estate, the clergy, remember, did not pay any taxes. The second estate of nobles had very few taxes, but the third estate was burdened with a whole slew of taxes. It is said that in the best of times the third estate struggled, and in the worst of times they starved. I'll dig into finances and taxation later on, but it played a crucial role in the destabilization of France's society. By the 1780s, the common folk of the Third Estate were about at their breaking point, and were sick of their unfair system of governance. They were fully aware that the First and Second Estates were not only living extravagant lives, but they owned nearly all the land, and to top it off, they weren't paying their fair share. It was this oppressive French society and poor social structure that, when coupled with other causes, would cast France into the fires of revolution. No one in the Third Estate enjoyed their position, but it would not be until food got short and debts extraordinary that the Third Estate finally united for change. The problem with France's society was that the Third Estate was not rich. In fact, they weren't even close. They were almost all overwhelmingly poor and impoverished. William Doyle speaks on this very problem, saying, "Poverty was France's most visible social problem. The poor numbered at the best of times a third of the population, 8 million people. In bad times, 2 or 3 million more might join. And over the 18th century, prices rose 3 times faster than wages. Jean-Marie Roland, a French inspector of manufactures, wrote in 1777, "Workmen need twice as much money for their subsistence, yet they earn no more than 50 years ago, when living was half as cheap." End quote. A parish priest in France also puts this in perspective, writing in 1774 of the poverty problem, saying, "All those whose occupation does not provide for much more than food and clothing are the ones who make beggars. As young men work, they marry, raise a first child, have much trouble in raising two, and if a third comes along, their work is no longer enough for food." End quote. And as you might imagine, people will go to the furthest extent possible if it means their family won't starve. In 1789, Emmanuel Joseph Soyens wrote on the hypocrisy of the French society in a pamphlet entitled "What is the Third Estate?" His most famous line really drives home the societal problems of France. It goes, quote, "What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What will it become? Something." Those were the primary social constraints and problems that eventually served to destabilize France in the 18th century. Now we take a look at the cultural causes of the French Revolution. French culture is very complicated during this time. Cultures are always complex, but France had gone through a transformative phase during the 18th century. France was an overwhelmingly Catholic state in 1700, and during that time the King of France and the clergymen of the church were treated as sacred, or at least seen as such. But by the 1780s, many in France no longer served the Catholic faith, and no longer saw the king and church as something divine. This transformation occurred because of the French Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason, and greatly transformed the Western world in the 17th and 18th centuries. Leaders of the movement included the likes of Francis Bacon, John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Voltaire. The Enlightenment stressed the use of reason, logic, fact, as well as the values of liberty and equality. The cultural movement directly influenced the English Bill of Rights, the entire American Revolution, and as we will see, the French Revolution as well. French writers point to the reign of Louis XV, which lasted from 1715 to 1774, as the time period in which the Enlightenment took roots in France. Indeed, the mid-1700s was a period of intellectual and cultural transition. In the 1720s, there were only a few private newspapers, journals, or periodicals, but by the 1770s, there were thousands of pieces of literature being published throughout France. Libraries, academies, and reading rooms were established throughout the country, and even peasants of the Third Estate had the opportunity to learn. This brings to mind a quote attributed to the Greek philosopher Socrates. "Education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel." And that is exactly what was happening to France in the mid-18th century. A fire was now lit. The French philosophers that tended to these intellectual flames were Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu. How did this help in causing the French Revolution, though? It seems like a good thing, doesn't it? And in the long run, it certainly was. Yet in the 1700s, the French Enlightenment was stressing individual rights, liberty, and freedom over traditional means of thought and governance. This means that the ideals of the French Enlightenment did not include the French monarchy, feudalism, the three-estate system, or the Catholic Church. This method of thinking actually appealed to almost all facets of French culture, from the nobles to the beggars. After seeing the triumph of Enlightenment ideals in America, the French populace began to desire a society based on freedom, personal liberty, and reason rather than the antiquated kingdom they resided in. The Enlightenment's correlation with the French Revolution is clear, but it is debatable how much of a cause it truly was. One thing that is not debatable, though, is that the Enlightenment opened people's eyes to the injustices in France. They openly criticized France's religious intolerance, the lack of freedom in the government, and the hypocrisy of the clergy and noble classes. And it was such widespread thinking that greatly influenced the rising tide of revolution in France. So much so that many of the revolutionary leaders of the 1789 revolution are considered leaders of the French Enlightenment. Shifting gears again, the political causes are somewhat more ambiguous than the cultural Enlightenment's influence, though. The baseline political causes simply amount to two primary dysfunctions in France's politics. One, poor leadership, or as I prefer to say, poor kingsmanship by Louis XVI. Two, a dysfunctional bureaucracy, especially when it came to the French parliaments. King Louis XVI was indeed a poor leader, and you'll learn much more about this in the coming episodes. He was often indecisive, shy, and simply did not have the political awareness or nerve to be a great king. That is all true, but I am obligated to defend him a little bit here. Louis XVI was handed a broken, failing state when he took the throne in 1774. Sure, he did not handle everything well, by no means. But all things considered, Louis did not steer France off a cliff. He was simply the man, or king in this case, in the driver's seat as France cascaded downhill. As for the second dysfunctional rung in French politics, bureaucracy is nearly always inefficient, and often intentionally so in modern societies. Eugene McCarthy once spoke on that, saying, "The only thing that saves us from bureaucracy is its inefficiency." But what France had in the old regime was a special sort of broken. This is mainly due to the existence of the French parliaments, pronounced, I believe, parlements. A British observer during the French Revolution described these parliaments as a, quote, horrible system of tyranny. And he was not alone in his beliefs, as you will soon find out. And in the old regime of France, these parliaments numbered around a dozen in total, depending on what year you choose. These parliaments were basically a really complicated network of hundreds of judges that gave rulings on laws and other such matters of state that were controversial enough to be brought to them. The thing was, though, they did not really have the authority. Well, sort of. You see, France, like many nations, did not have a written constitution dictating the basic functions of their state. Much of their government, actually most of their government, was based on tradition, and at some point earlier in the old regime of France, one of Louis XVI's predecessors had relegated some of the crown's authority to a network of nobles, and the parliaments continued to more or less exist from then on. The problem with these parliaments came in the 1780s, when France was tumbling towards a societal collapse. King Louis XVI and his ministers saw what was happening and sought to rectify the situation, or at least lessen his population's burden, by reforming taxation and certain laws restricting the lower classes of France. It was during the king's campaign for reforms that the parliaments got in the way. You see, the members of the parliaments were nobles, and they saw that many of the king's measures would hurt their high-class privileges and change the old regime into something far more inclined to the Third Estate. So the nobles on the parliaments did something despicable. They blocked the reforms passed by King Louis and his ministers. This defiance by the Second Estate shocked the king, and he was so taken aback that he was personally offended and retreated from the reforms he had proposed. He even unwisely fired his minister that had proposed the reforms to him. This terrible turn of events showed the poor leadership of King Louis XVI, because if he had been more like his forebears, he perhaps would have demanded the passage of his reforms on his authority as the absolute monarch of the Kingdom of France. That is easier said than done, though. Moreover, the defiance of the parliaments and the Second Estate at large showed the broken nature of the old regime. This is so because how could any reforms come to be if the people passing judgment were biased and saw any such movements towards equality as an affront to their station in life? All in all, France was politically broken by the 1780s. It was as if an object was obstructing the cogs of change from allowing France to move on. The Third Estate, the literal 97% of France, saw the obstruction as the greed-rotten First and Second Estates, and if the king did not support them, then they would do away with him as well. Thus the actions of the Parlements and the inaction by King Louis XVI accelerated the coming of the French Revolution of 1789. Lastly, we come to the most prolific and well-known of the causes, France's financial crisis. François Marquis de Bouillé, a French royalist and supporter of his king, wrote in 1797 saying, "The most striking of the country's troubles was the chaos in its finances." That makes it seem as if French finances suddenly tanked during Louis XVI's reign, and I have seen some people even claim that during Louis XVI's tenure he tripled France's deficit. That is not true at all, though, for the Kingdom of France had been in economic troubles since the late 1600s. Economic troubles is an odd term, though, and what I mean by it in this context is that France had begun taking on massive amounts of debt during the reign of Louis XIV. These debts were due to the massive wars that France was thrown into over and over. But during Louis XIV's reign, the debt was manageable. Debt is not inherently a bad thing, and is often a good thing when it comes to a country if it is managed correctly. Louis XIV managed it correctly during his tenure as king, but when Louis XV took the reins, France's finances began to progressively go downhill. Louis XV's reign stretched for almost 60 years, and during it, more massive wars broke out that included the likes of the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. Simon Schama described the situation as such: "The wretched end to Louis XIV's war saw simultaneously the specter of bankruptcy, the disintegration of the French army, tax revolts, and mass famine. And by 1714 the debt was calculated at around 2.6 billion livres. Les livres is the French currency, by the way. But by 1774 the debt had almost tripled that number. Thus by the time Louis XVI took the crown, the French deficit was at somewhere around 8 to 9 billion livres. Before the events of 1789, though, that debt would be risen again by an extra 2 to 3 billion livres. This extra deficit was due to poor money management by a despicable financial minister named Jacques Necker, as well as massive spending on the American War of Independence, and Louis XV's spending on the French Navy, amongst other expenditures. Once again, though, I stress this: the debt, as extravagant as it was not perilous in itself. Debt is extremely hard to understand. It can be a tool, a burden, or sometimes the hammer that destroys a nation. To simplify this in our story, Louis XIV used his growing debt as a tool. Louis XV saw it become a burden, and sadly for Louis XVI, the debt smashed his kingdom from under himself. So how did this come to pass? How did France allow itself to crumble to poor financial management? Perhaps the best way to explain that is to observe how other European nations during the same time avoided such ruin. The British Empire was in the same economic predicament. The Dutch Republic was devastated, the Prussian state was as well. Taking Great Britain as a case study, the British went through the exact economic struggles that France did during the 18th century. In fact, Britain experienced even more wars and obviously did not always win. The difference was primarily societal. England's society and bureaucracy had already modernized for the most part. As Churchill wrote, "In England the armed aristocracy had destroyed itself in the dynastic civil wars of the 15th century. France had been less well served by her history." Meaning that England had already been forced into societal change, and had adapted quite well to a system of constitutional monarchy where elected members of parliament led the government alongside their monarch. Thus, Great Britain had a more secure society, and their government and people could pass and uphold higher and more far-reaching taxation than France ever could. This also gave England the ability to draw loans with extremely low interest rates due to their economic stability. Furthermore, this meant that Britain had a far stronger society and could better withstand their financial burdens. France had not modernized and had yet to be forced to adapt its society, and that is why the financial situation brought the proverbial hammer down on France's Ancien Regime in 1789. So that covers the primary social, cultural, political, and financial causes of the French Revolution. I dare say, though, the causes still seem a little muddy, if I do so say myself. Allow me to put all that information in context and put a nice bow on this episode. What truly compelled France and its people to revolution in 1789 was an amalgamation of factors. Many obviously point to the financial crisis, but that alone was not enough to take down the Kingdom of France. It took a series of factors, many of which I have now mentioned, to propel the country into social anarchy. The broken political machinery in France, the inspirational and radical Enlightenment movement, and the disastrously archaic socialist state structure all played crucial roles. And when in the 1780s all these causes were combined, with dreadful winters, terrible harvests, and widespread famine, France was absolutely destined for some sort of social cataclysm. That is why the French Revolution occurred when it did. Please come back next episode as the story of the 1789 revolution begins in earnest. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes.
Thank you, and good night.